What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the February 2019 format. You know, not everyone can afford to pay over $1,000 to play something like Danger Thunder Dragon, which you need 3 copies of Colossus, you need stuff like the Danger Engine, or maybe afford a playset of Sky Striker Engage for your Sky Striker deck, or something like Pot of Extravagance for your Altergeist deck. But this video is going to be covering 5 budget options that you could play at a regional or YCS, have a fighting chance at winning, and it's only going to run you about $100 to $150, counting both main and extra deck. Now, that may sound a little bit expensive for a budget deck, but you have to pay a little bit to play competitively, and honestly, for a fraction of what it would cost you to play some of the highest tier 1 decks, I still think that's pretty good to give them a run for their money. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. And if you really love the content that I produce on this channel, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because it's thanks to people like Brendan and Luke that I'm able to bring you this content on a daily basis. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Kicking things off with number 5, I'm gonna go ahead with Pendulum Magician. Now, Pendulum Magician is no shy contender away from the top 5 competitive budget list. It's been on here for quite some time, always fluctuating in its spot, but that's just because so much of the deck is so inexpensive, because it all came from a single core set, that a lot of the cards just had so many duplicates, it's really not hard to assemble a core for the entire deck. Not to mention, the deck has pretty much had so many reprints of all of its other power cards, stuff like Pendulum Call, Duelist Alliance, all these other good things, so the main deck is incredibly cheap. But what's fantastic is that you see that Pendulum Magician is still able to compete. In the past several YCSs, and even most recently as YCS Chicago, Pendulum Magician still manages to make the top 32 cut. And when you look at the builds that these players are playing, they're honestly not really too expensive. The main deck is pretty much just comprised of all Pendulum monsters for the most part, which makes sense because it's Pendulum Magician, and then the extra decks where things are going to start to get a little bit pricey just because you have to get some specific one-of cards, but ultimately you can still build the deck for $100 to $150 maximum for that main and extra deck. And what I love about Pendulum Magician is that it's so resilient in that you're able to just combo off with boards that end on multiple negations if you go first. You have the ability to break boards going second because you have the pendulum summoning mechanic to help you with that, something that if you're not playing pendulums you have no access to, so that kind of just gives the deck a very significant edge over some of its other competitors. And also, the deck can do some pretty unfair things now with DDD King Kali Yuga, and I think that's pretty cute to see how Pendulum Magician has adapted. And if you want to spend a little bit extra money, you can go for a Borreload Savage Dragon, which isn't too expensive relative, but compared to the rest of the deck it might be, but it's still a nice addition to the deck coming out of Savage Strike. Pendulum Magician is probably the tried and true budget player's option if you want to play competitively, and that's why I had to put it at number 5 on this list. But coming in at number 4, we have a brand new challenger entering the ring, and that is Salamang. Now, I know a lot of you guys are probably wondering why I have Salamang so low on this list, because honestly, Salamang is probably going to be the cheapest competitive budget deck that you could possibly afford for the foreseeable future, considering the fact that you can just pick up 3 structure decks and have a fairly cohesive deck for what it is, and then with a couple upgrades, you're going to have like a tier 1.5, tier 2-ish deck, and that's fantastic because you have a deck that's able to assemble a pretty significant board going first. It's going to have multiple disruptions as well as protection, and that's pretty nice. Not to mention you get your Ash Blossoms at a very nominal price, so that's a nice way to incorporate some hand traps, but I guess you can extend that to the rest of the decks on this list as well if you really want to get a playset of Ash Blossom once Soul Burner is released. And going second, the deck can still OTK within its entire archetype. You don't really need too many extra cards to do that, making so that you don't need something like Borrelsword Dragon, which can cost a lot of money. However, I have Salamang very low on the list because I don't exactly know how it's going to shape up in the current competitive climate. The reason for that is because since Danger Thunder Dragon is the strongest deck of this format, that's probably Salamang's worst matchup, and if you're going to be playing a lot of Thunder Dragons going into a competitive event, you're not not going to have a good time with Salamang, considering the fact that it relies heavily on being able to do a lot of searching, and Thunder Dragon Colossus pretty much just completely shuts that down entirely. So while Salamang is an incredibly good budget option, especially for the price, it's something that I'm hesitant to put any higher than number 4 on this list, solely because of the fact that we don't know how it's going to perform until it's been released and had the opportunity to prove itself. But coming in at number 3, we have another deck that is highly mischievous when it comes to this specific format, and that is Prank Kids. Remember, Prank Kids won a YCS not too long ago, and the format wasn't really too different. It was actually worse, arguably, because we had so many FDKs and things running around that Prank Kids also had to deal with. But Prank Kids is a deck that has been able to realistically have very good matchups in this current environment. It has a very good Thunder Dragon matchup. It has a very good Sky Striker matchup. It can struggle against Altergeist, but with the climate looking like Altergeist isn't going to be as big as a lot of people thought, especially when you look at YCS Chicago in the top 32, if you can go an entire day and not play any Altergeist, you might be looking pretty good with Prank Kids. I mean, this deck just has some incredible abilities by being able to just do some incredible link climbing, and yeah, you're going to want to have some extra deck cards like Borolo Dragon, and if you can afford it, Boral Sword Dragon, just because of the fact that you have that extra OTK potential if you need it, even though that's an upgrade and not necessary in the main and extra deck by itself. Most of the cards in this deck came from a single set, aside from stuff like maybe Instant Fusion or other cards you might need just to help supplement and complement the deck for consistency purposes. The deck can do a lot of really crazy things, and I think it'd be really awesome to see Prank Kids continue to do as well as they have. I wouldn't be surprised if you take this to a regional with a budget version and you end up winning the event. And if you look at some of the versions that won the YCS not too long ago, if you look at the version that just got top 16 at YCS Chicago, frankly, these aren't really too expensive compared especially to the other decks in the format. The biggest drawback I see with a deck like Prank Kids is that it's a very, very heavy combo deck, and it is very, very complex. I would say this has a very steep learning curve compared to a lot of other decks, especially that are on this list. So you're gonna have to dedicate yourself and put in the time to learn all the different combo trees and the intricacies of the deck if you want to see success. It's not nearly as linear as a lot of other decks, so that could punish you in the long run if you're not as familiar with it. But if you take the time and dedicate yourself and you don't want to spend a lot of money, Prank Kids might be the deck for you. Now, coming in at number 2, we have another combo deck, and that is Dark Warrior. Yes, Dark Warrior, or really anything that can just turbo out something like Azathoth, is a really, really strong option right now. We have seen several versions of this deck, and there's so many different things you can do to modify it, but honestly, the core of the deck is so inexpensive, and especially to have access to tools like Rusty Bardich, or to be able to summon something like Azathoth during your opponent's turn, that can just be enough to end the game right there. You don't even need something like Boral Sword Dragon, because you can just end your opponent's turn since they can't really use a lot of monster effects, then just start link climbing, going into some crazy plays, and just kill your opponent. There's been so many different variants of this deck that can rip cards out of your opponent's hand with stuff like Neo Space Connector and Aqua Dolphin. The link climbing that this deck has is just insane, and yeah, sure, Boral Sword Dragon might be an expensive card, but you still have access to stuff like the Nightmares, Nightmare Cerberus, Nightmare, Phoenix. These are all easy, very generic, very cheap cards that you can acquire that are just going to allow you to do your generic link plays and are going to help you break boards. But then if you go first, you have your first turn Azathoth play, and that's honestly good enough some of the times just to win you some matches. Obviously, there's an upgrade path here, like I said, with stuff like Boral Sword Dragon, giving you that extra OTK potential, since a deck like Dark Warrior or any of its variants are able to very easily spam the board with monsters. But honestly, for what you're getting, this is an incredibly powerful deck and something you definitely don't want to underestimate. Budget version or not, this is something that can really take your opponents off guard, and sometimes there's really nothing they can do about it. So before we get to my number 1, I did have a couple of honorable mentions. First up is Guru Control. Now, the reason I have it in the honorable mentions is because having cards like Infinite Impermanence and Pot of Extravagance definitely help this deck out significantly, but you can still play the deck without them. You might have to run something like Desires, which kind of affects, your deck's consistency a lot, because you might banish some very important combo pieces, but honestly, Guru Control has been able to compete, and you can play it in a budget form and then just have a path to upgrade with stuff like Impermanence when it gets released in dual power in April, as well as Pot of Extravagance if you can manage to get your hands on them. And something like True Draco is something I also wanted to talk about, a deck that actually had a surprise showing at YCS Chicago and actually just won a regional this past weekend. So Draco is still able to compete and is one of the cheapest budget options out there, having a ton of draw power, a ton of consistency, doesn't need an extra deck, so that's something really good it has going for it, and you also don't need Pot of Extravagance. So those are two really nice options I thought I'd go ahead and mention. But that is going to bring us to my number one competitive budget deck for the February 2019 format, and if you haven't already figured it out, I'm giving it to Guardragon Crusadia. Holy shit, like, the fact that this deck is able to consistently pump out boards of like 3 to 5 negations, and then in addition to that, if it goes second, it can just do typical Crusadia shenanigans and just OTK your opponent with one swing with an Equimax. Like, this deck is just insane, and what I love about this deck, as well as all the other decks on here as well, for the most part, is that because most of these decks are combo decks, you don't really need to play any hand traps whatsoever, which is where a significant cost of a deck may come from. You can just play more Crusadia cards, more Guardragon cards, and yeah, sure, there's some expensive cards in the extra deck like a Saryuja or two, but realistically, the main deck and the extra deck for Guardragon Crusadia is so affordable that, again, it is a combo deck and you need to learn the different lines and the different intricacies of the deck, but if you can take the time and figure this out, this is one of the strongest decks you have going into this format. Like, this deck is just absurd, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this deck does win a YCS or wins a big premier event soon, because frankly, it is a little bit fragile, but if this deck goes off, there is usually nothing stopping it. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top budget picks for the February 2019 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.